The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German. Panzer Commander Hans Muller could hear the distinctive rumble of American Sherman tanks approaching through the canyon. He smiled confidently. His Tiger tank was superior in every way: thicker armor, a more powerful gun, better optics. The Americans didn't stand a chance. But then something happened that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As his crew prepared to engage, the radio operator suddenly clutched his headphones and shouted that he was hearing American tank commanders talking to each other. Not just one or two tanks, but dozens of them, coordinating their movements across miles of desert terrain as if they were standing in the same room. Muller dismissed it as impossible. Radio technology simply couldn't do that. The interference alone would make it useless in combat. He was wrong, and that mistake would cost Germany the war. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that every single American Sherman tank rolling off the assembly lines carried a technological marvel that was years ahead of anything the Axis powers possessed. While German engineers were still struggling with basic amplitude modulation, radios that crackled with static and died, after a few miles, American tankers were communicating with crystal clear frequency modulation across distances that seemed impossible. The SCR-508 radio system wasn't just better than what the Germans had. It was revolutionary. Imagine trying to coordinate a battle using walkie-talkies from the 1980s while your enemy is using smartphones with perfect 5G coverage. That's essentially what was happening on the battlefields of World War II. Lieutenant Jake Morrison from Ohio sat in his Sherman tank outside the German lines near Kasserine Pass, his hand on the radio transmitter. Through his headphones, he could hear Captain Reynolds 3 miles to his left, Sergeant Thompson 2 miles to his right, and Lieutenant Colonel Patterson coordinating the entire assault from 5 miles behind the front lines. The audio was so clear that Morrison could hear Reynolds breathing heavily between words. 25 watts of transmission power meant these radios could reach out across vast distances. The crystal-controlled frequency modulation meant the signal stayed locked on target, without drift or interference, while German tankers were shouting into their microphones, hoping someone might hear them through the crackling static. American crews were having normal conversations, sharing intelligence in real time, calling in artillery strikes with pinpoint accuracy, and moving as a coordinated force rather than isolated metal boxes. The Germans noticed something was very wrong within weeks of encountering American armor in North Africa. Their after-action reports from 1943 are filled with confused observations. How were American tanks appearing exactly where they were needed? How were they coordinating flanking maneuvers across terrain where visual contact was impossible? How were they calling in artillery support with such devastating accuracy? German intelligence officers captured American tanks and examined them carefully. They found the SCR-508 radios and were stunned. The technology was so advanced that some German engineers initially believed they were looking at prototype equipment, not standard issue. When they learned that every Sherman tank had one of these radios, the implications were terrifying. But here's where it gets even more remarkable. The Germans couldn't copy the technology. They tried. They reverse-engineered captured radios. They put their best scientists on the problem. But the manufacturing precision required, the crystal oscillators, the frequency modulation circuits, it was all beyond their industrial capacity to mass produce. Only 20% of German tanks had any radio at all, and those were primitive 10-watt AM sets that were nearly useless in combat conditions. The German tankers knew they were outmatched technologically, but the high command refused to believe that radio communications could be a decisive factor in armored warfare. General Heinz Guderian himself dismissed reports about American radio superiority as exaggerations or excuses for tactical failures. The idea that something as mundane as a radio could determine the outcome of tank battles seemed absurd to men who had conquered France with blitzkrieg tactics. But on the battlefield, reality was undeniable. American tank platoons moved like packs of wolves, coordinating their attacks, covering each other's blind spots, concentrating fire on single targets with devastating effect. German panzers, even the mighty Tigers and Panthers with their superior armor and guns, fought as lone predators. A Tiger tank might destroy 3 or 4 Shermans in a battle, but those Shermans were talking to 20 other Shermans who were already moving into flanking positions, calling in air support and coordinating with infantry units. Morrison remembered the battle outside Corentin in June 1944. His platoon encountered 2 German Panther tanks in an open field. By every technical specification, the Panthers should have destroyed them. Their 75mm guns could penetrate Sherman armor at distances where Sherman guns were ineffective. But Morrison's platoon had something better than thicker armor. They had information. Within seconds of spotting the Panthers, Morrison was on the radio. He called in their exact position to Captain Reynolds, who was approaching from the east. Sergeant Thompson's platoon, 2 miles south, immediately changed course to intercept. Lieutenant Baker called in artillery coordinates. The entire engagement was over in 4 minutes. The Panthers destroyed 2 Shermans, but they were surrounded, outmaneuvered, and eliminated by a force that moved as a single organism rather than individual machines. The German crews never knew what hit them. From their perspective, they had destroyed 2 enemy tanks and were preparing to engage more when suddenly they were being fired upon from 3 different directions simultaneously. It seemed like magic. It was technology. As the war progressed and American forces pushed into Germany itself, the radio advantage became even more pronounced. German tank commanders who survived the war later wrote about the psychological impact of fighting. An enemy who always seemed to know where you were, who could coordinate attacks across entire battlefronts, who could call in devastating airstrikes within minutes of contact. Some German tankers reported, feeling like they were fighting ghosts who could see through walls and read their minds. But the most crushing realization for the German military came in late 1944, when their intelligence finally compiled a complete assessment of American tank communications. The report concluded that the United States had equipped its entire armored force with radio, technology that Germany couldn't hope to match even if the war continued for another 5 years. The industrial capacity, the technical expertise, the manufacturing precision. America had simply leapfrogged German technology by an entire generation. The strategic implications were staggering. All the German advantages in tank design, the thick armor, the powerful guns, the superior optics were negated by an invisible network of radio waves. Tank battles are won by whoever can concentrate force at the decisive point. American commanders could concentrate their forces with a speed and precision that seemed supernatural to their German counterparts, while German tanks wandered the battlefield in relative isolation, unable to coordinate effectively, unable to share intelligence, unable to adapt to rapidly changing situations. By the end of the war, American armored divisions were destroying German panzer units at ratios that should have been impossible given the technical superiority of German tanks. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the final proof. Despite being outnumbered and caught by surprise, American armored units used their radio networks to coordinate a defense and counterattack that shattered the German offensive. German tank commanders reported feeling like they were fighting in the dark, while their enemies had perfect vision. The SCR 508 radio system never got the recognition it deserved. History books focus on the Sherman's reliability, American industrial production, and the bravery of tank crews. All of those factors mattered. But the secret weapon, the invisible advantage, that turned the tide of armored warfare was a 25-pound box of electronics that let American tankers talk to each other with perfect clarity across vast distances. While German engineers were building bigger guns and thicker armor, American engineers had quietly revolutionized battlefield communications in a way that would shape military doctrine for the next 80 years. Hans Muller survived the war, In his memoirs, written in the 1970s, he described the moment he finally understood why Germany lost the tank war. It wasn't American courage or numbers or even industrial production, though all of those helped. It was simpler and more profound than that. The Americans could talk to each other, and the Germans couldn't in modern warfare. That made all the difference.